是那种在那儿就是当地的学员，现在可以就是在那儿，对，现在是上。我也知道。这个大毕业的东西啊，现在开始上。Caricare le CD mattine non facile,
I think one of them is
That's fine. Of all the things you could be. Yeah. Actually, he already said
India. We're near the We're near the and have like
no, non lo so, dovrebbe essere qua questo. Il seminario non è col cellulare.
He's very serious.
L'avevo trovato.
No, I don't think his presentation
Ma non funzionava, si può provare a guardare, però
Yeah, so good morning. You'll be having your tutorials, I think, shortly after, and the idea basically would be to, the tutorials for this would be next week, right? So not immediately after. I believe Nigel would just be sort of giving you an overview of the tutorials, the ground to be covered. And maybe take questions, and then by the time you get to next week, you'll be able to prepare for the tutorials on this particular subject. So I did say here that the principal objective is to introduce some very important building blocks that we will regularly encounter and, more importantly, use to achieve particular outcomes. And when we begin to use them, you're going to have two things in mind. One is sort of your policeman hat, i.e. not transgressing the law, knowing what sort of interests will be engaged, right, so that you do not transgress the law. But your client is not asking you to be a policeman. He's not asking you to be a compliance officer. He wants you to do something. So the other side to it is a transactional side, right, which is how can we deliver a particular outcome. Now, so those two questions, or those two ideas, are central to what we talk about in this course. And when you look at the very first objective, you'll notice I say that the second, third, and fourth are key instruments of corporate engineering. So here I'm referring to you being able to create structures, right, to meet the objectives of the client. So by this I mean your ability to understand what a share is so as to be able to design the share you want is important. You design the share you want to meet the exigencies of the moment as your client has put to you. And in some cases, you may decide that, well, I don't even want to take a share for whatever reasons, but I want to be able to take a share. So how do you do that? Well, there we get to equity warrants. Right? And you'll notice that equity warrants feature in many transactional outcomes, where for one reason or the other, you do not necessarily want to take a share, but you want to protect your right to have those shares issued to you. And the depository receipt is also kind of similar in the sense that you want to take some shares, but you're worried about tradability. So maybe those shares are issued by a company in an emerging market. You want to be able to take shares in an emerging market, but you're worried about tradability. You're worried about that particular market. So the question is, how do I, in a sense, take a share and have the benefits of liquidity and protection, right? So this is where your depository receipt will come in. We often refer to it as American depository receipts or global depository receipts. If it's issued in the States, then it's ADR. And if it's issued, like many things in the world, outside America, then we're just one country. Then we call it global. But basically the idea is the same thing. So I kind of flag that up so that you see the sort of things we can use to achieve particular outcomes as regards corporate engineering. But even as we do corporate engineering, we need to also have our policeman hat on to know when we would be transgressing certain norms. And the best way to understand this is to get a feel for those interests that have to be protected every time. By now you know creditor interests really are to be protected. So how do we protect creditor interests? Well, you've got to be clear about share capital and the significance of its measurement. Right? So you've got to be clear about share capital and how to measure it. So the idea of share capital and its measurement goes to the heart of the protection of creditors, whereas the others are more contractual, right? So what does this mean? If we just pause here, what does this mean? It means that when we talk about designing the share, i.e. share rights, creating equity warrants, depository receipts, we are in the domain of contract. We're just writing our contract as we see fit, right? And there's no limit to what we can do, right? On the other hand, when we deal with the others, we're really talking about mandatory rules, right? So mandatory rules. So there's a difference between the mandatory rules and your usual rules that people can apply, which you can do. So the significance basically is that when you apply mandatory rules, you cannot oust them. The shareholders cannot come together and say, we're going to ratify conduct which will be a breach of share capital rules, right? All the shareholders could not do this. And sometimes you see some cases, they come up again and again, and we're going to discuss these cases as we go along, where the shareholders purport to ratify this, right? And the lawyers purport to do this. And you keep on asking yourself whether they do not understand the fundamentals here. The fundamentals here are that you just cannot ratify it. You can't, in a sense, write these rules away, right? So those are key ideas that I just want us to keep in mind. So please be bold when it comes to designing rights, right? Be bold when it comes to designing rights, but be mindful of mandatory rules. Okay, and so that's really a high-level description of what the seminar is about. Sorry. So it's really just a high-level description. Now, so in terms of detail, we would look at the nature of a share. It's important to understand the nature of a share because juridically it's very different from any other claim. But functionally, it might look similar, right? So if you create a debt, juridically it's a chosen action, like a share, right? A chosen action is property that you cannot physically possess. The word chosen action comes from Old French. As I'm sure you know, after the Norman conquest, a lot of ideas of English law came from the French. So essentially, we're really talking about items of property that you cannot physically enjoy. Actually, you enforce them by way of action, right? Hence the term chosen action. And it's important to be clear about the kind of rights that this kind of property creates. Economically, everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody wants a return. The only difference between them is in terms of risk appetite, right? So the people who go for a share are prepared to take more risk, right? And therefore, economically, we would say they are residual claimants. They are residual claimants. They're at the bottom of the pecking order, right? They are claimants, but they get the last after you pay every creditor. Whereas creditors obviously have a different risk appetite. They don't want to wait. They want to be on top. And more or less, that structure has to be protected by the law. And how does the law protect it? It protects it through the rules on capital, right? Not the rules on shares, the rules on capital. Of course, there's a relationship between the rules on shares and the rules on capital, because when you pay for the share, you create the share capital. The share itself is a separate item of property, right? So when we study the share, we study the share as a separate item of property. But when we talk about paying for the share, we're actually thinking about the rules on share capital. We're talking about how do we accumulate the capital fund, how do we measure the capital fund, how do we protect the capital fund. Right? Okay, and so obviously we're also going to talk about the shareholders' right of participation, which is something you would have to deal with in any term sheet. How do we configure it? So we go back to the whole business of engineering and being confident you can do anything, more or less. And then we'll talk about the terminology of capital. And we introduce an idea called the concept of legal capital. You're not going to see the concept of legal capital in the Companies Act, right? So it's a construct that helps us understand a body of rules. So if you look at the Companies Act, you will not find the term legal capital. But what we're going to do is use the term legal capital to denote a construct to capture a compendium of rules, which we call capital rules, right? So when we think about legal capital, think about how do we measure it, right? How do we measure it? And then, should I say lastly, not lastly, we'll talk about thing capitalization and the significance. So essentially, those are the key objectives. And before I proceed, let me just take you to some questions, just to give an idea of where we're going. Now, so here we have Section 11, subsection 4 of Ruritania's Corporation Statute. And by the way, this is real, right? In the country, obviously, does not exist, but there is a country with this provision. And right, and the law basically says that, subject to the provisions of this act, the rights and liabilities attaching to the shares of a company shall be dependent on the terms of issue and the company's articles. Right? So it's saying, you guys are the masters of the game. You write your own contract, right? And then it goes on. B, notwithstanding anything to the contrary in the terms or the articles, includes the right. So notice, there's a mandatory norm being introduced. It's trumping your bargain. So it's saying, regardless of what you did, regardless of the terms you stipulated, we're going to trump it. And we're going to give everybody a right to attend the general meeting and to vote. So it includes the right to attend any general meeting of the company and vote at such a meeting. And I say, is there anything wrong with this provision? Yeah?
Shareholders do not necessarily want to have voting rights as long as they have a preference in receiving
Exactly. So this statute is defective, right? This statute is defective. I mean, it looks good on the face of it, and maybe I suppose instinctively, wedded to notions of democracy, we all think everybody should have a vote, right? At least most of us think that way. But there is a problem here, because the operative rule when it comes to creating a share, as I said earlier, it is within our control. We do it as we see fit. But in this Companies Act, they have undermined that principle, right, by introducing a mandatory norm. So there is a problem with this. And that just illustrates the point I've been making when I say designing shares and all that. In this particular jurisdiction, they're going to have problems. Now, and the other question I'd like to just call your attention to, right? Obviously, I know you've not looked at it. The idea basically is to just flag it up so that when I go through the material, you'll be able to identify this. So consider this. We have a financial market player, so a private equity operator who wishes to invest in a company, NewCo. And what it does is it really wants an early exit. It needs to leave this company within 3 to 5 years. It wants a good rate of return. And it wants control rights to ensure that NewCo is managed properly. Right? Now, so here the question is, we should negotiate the share rights of the investor, the private equity investor, and the management team in NewCo, and I produced a term sheet earlier. But the point here is this. An investor wants an early exit. Now, a share, if you become a shareholder, you basically subscribe to a rule that locks you in. You do not have the right to liquidate the company at will, right? Shareholders are locked in. That's the whole idea of entity shielding, right? There are two ideas in company law, owner shielding and entity shielding. Owner shielding is really about limited liability, right? I'm an owner, right, of a share, and therefore I have limited liability, so I am shielded, owner shielded. Entity shielding means that the company, the entity, is shielded from my creditors, right? So if I owe you, you can't go to the company to attach the company's assets. It also means that the company is shielded from me. I can't just say, oh, you know what, I'm broke today. I can go to the company and deep in. So what we basically have in company law is a rule of liquidation protection. The company is protected from liquidation by the shareholders. And what does this mean in practical terms? It means that the default rule surely must be that we can't just simply change our minds after 3 years and say, give me my money back. And that's what this person is saying, right? So the question then is, how do we make this possible? How do we find a way to find a way around this particular rule to enable this early exit work? And the easy way to do it is to design the share, right, as, let's assume you go for a share, to design it as redeemable, right? You design the share as redeemable. And then, but you then may say, well, if you design the share as redeemable, if I wear my sort of corporate engineering hat and design it as redeemable, my compliance hat tells me that we will be eaten into the capital fund, right? So that your compliance hat kicks in to say, well, okay, how do we protect creditors? So we protect creditors by a rule that allows us redeem only from distributable profits. That way, we don't touch capital. For us to be able to redeem from distributable profits, we need to be able to measure capital in that treasury box. So when we raise capital, and it's in that treasury box, we need to be able to make a distinction between capital that we have raised and profit that is distributable. It is the profit that is distributable that will be used for redemption. So this way, we can then tell the guy that, you know what, we can make this happen. Right? We can give you your 3 to 5 year exit because we believe this company will generate profits. Right? And because this company will generate profit, we will not be flouting any rule of company law because it will come from distributable profits. And the guy says, I want a good rate of return. I want a good rate of return. What is he saying? He's saying, I don't want to be an ordinary shareholder. I don't want to be a residual claimant at the bottom of the pecking order. I want a good rate, i.e., I have identified what is good. Right? I'm not relying on hope. I've identified what is good. And what is good is a number. So I want this coupon rate. In other words, he's saying, I want preference shares. Right? I want preference shares. And not just preference shares. Because what are preference shares? You've got to state what you want. If you don't state it, then you've not designed it well. Right? The courts are not going to infer anything. Right? So you've got to be clear to state, right, not only a prior return to capital, which is what you're doing with 3 to 5 years exit. So not only are you designing it so clearly to say, I have a prior right of return to capital. I get paid first before the other guys, right? Because I get paid within 3 to 5 years. I also want a prior right to income, right? In other words, I get paid dividends before any other person. And I want it fixed so that it's good. And I don't want you to miss it. So it's got to be cumulative, right? So if you miss 1 year, you must pay the next. And then he says, but I also am greedy and I want control rights. Because at this point we'll be saying, why do you want control rights? As the gentleman behind said, that somebody could bargain for a high coupon, right? And if you bargain for a high coupon, you do not need to vote, right? So why do you want control rights? We're already giving you money. You don't need control rights, Right? So so the question says negotiate. Negotiate. That means obviously it means you can't give in to everything. You've got to be able to point out the inadequacy or the limitations of what the person is putting forward. So it says negotiate the share rights of the investor and the management team in UCO using the term sheet above. Right? So that's where, those are some of the issues that will come in, the ability to be able to put a contrary view to the other party. And then it says, but what if the company, the issuer, is advised to issue bonds with equity warrants? Why should this be considered from the company's perspective and the investor's perspective? So essentially, to issue a bond with a share warrant, otherwise known as an equity warrant, is essentially similar to issuing a convertible bond. That's it. So, think about it. You issue somebody with a convertible bond, you basically say it's convertible into equity, right? So when you give somebody, when you say I'm issuing you bonds, i.e., I'm creating debt securities with an equity warrant, we're simply giving you the option to subscribe for shares in our company, right? So in other words, if you're not too sure of the company as the investor, if you're not too sure about the fortunes of the company, you may say, well, the best way to proceed would be to hedge my risk by going for something really secure, i.e. my bond. But because I think this company could have an upside, the company could be good, I want to have a warrant that grants me an option to participate, right? In which case you will not be talking about 3 to 5 years exit, right? Because now you think, the company's going to do very well, right? So you can see how we bring all these things together. And from the perspective of the company, the benefit of this is flexibility, and the company has the benefit of issuing a debt security, which also means that interest payments are tax deductible, right? So those are the sort of things that come in. But you can see from this simple question, we had to think clearly about the design of shares, right? And as we were designing the shares, thinking about the commercial objectives of each party, we also had to be mindful of mandatory norms, right? And the clear mandatory norm we talked about here is the mandatory norm that basically says you can only redeem shares from distributable profits, isn't it? So you can't really design if you don't really know those mandatory norms. So that's why I gave that example. And then lastly here, I just use this to flag up I said, what if Ruritania is an emerging market and foreign investors are not keen on its shares? Is a depository receipt the solution? So these are certificates that, and the reason I bring this, by the way, is that there is a question as to whether these receipts should be categorized as equity or debt. So there's certificates that represent ownership of a certain number of a company's securities. So in this case, it would be shares, right? But the shares are different, right? The certificates are a separate instrument, and these separate instruments can be traded on the international markets. And so what I do there is to show you how it will be done. So a depository bank buys shares in their company in some emerging markets and issues it to investors. The company itself deposits the shares with the share certificates, not the shares. You can't possess the shares. The share certificates with the local custodian bank, and then that bank basically acts as a custodian for the depository bank, and then of course instructions are issued as to how to vote. But the idea basically is that by holding this certificate, you are able to avoid the limitations of the home market, right? So, and that's basically how you do it. So you'll notice a lot of emerging markets tend to do this in the London market by using GDRs, right? And so in terms of how you classify, it's really an open one. So for instance, the listing rules basically say, well, we're not going to classify. We're just going to have our own system. We're not going to tell you that this is debt or equity, right? On the other hand, if you look at the DTR rules, the DTR rules basically say that they are not debt. They're not debt instruments. So it's not very clear how you really classify these instruments. And this really underscores the point I made earlier about being very clear juridically about what it is we're describing. So I go back now and start with the introduction. But let me pause here and ask if anybody has any questions so far. Yeah?
What is the financial purpose of the GDRs?
Sorry?
I don't understand the financial purpose of the GDRs.
Yes. So the purpose is to enable, from the perspective of the issuer, to enable the issuer make itself investable to external parties. So if you're operating in Algeria and your market is not very liquid, people don't want to go there, one way you can sort of get foreign capital into your market is to have this kind of arrangement, so that there is then a link between the securities, which have all manner of problems, i.e. they're not liquid, affected by your home jurisdiction. There's a link between the securities and the receipt, which is then traded, right? So by doing that, you in a sense decouple this certificate from the risks and negative views people may have about that particular market. And essentially everybody then trades in the global depository receipts. So it's simply that. It's a way of, at least certainly, I mean, from two sides. From the perspective of the foreign investor who wants to go into a market. So imagine you want to go into a market which is really good, but you're worried about that particular market, then it's safe to do this. From the perspective of the issuer, it also gives them exposure. So I know, for instance, a lot of banks in Africa come to the London market by issuing GDRs. And if you look at the capital base of those banks, you'll see that a lot of it is foreign capital, right? Now, the real problem here is if you have exchange control regulations, and you try to, if you have exchange control regulations and people pull out, right? Because now what you've done is create a gateway for a lot of capital to come in. So assuming the economy goes bad and a lot of capital rushes out, then that could create problems for your country. Malaysia had this some years ago, where there was a huge outflow of capital. Even Iceland, right, had that. So some people worry about this from an exchange control perspective. I know exchange control is something people don't sort of talk about these days because, not many, well, if you're in the UK, for instance, you probably can have a career as a lawyer and not even know about exchange control, right? Because, there's free movement of capital, right? Exchange controls actually ended in the UK in 1979 when the Exchange Control Act was abolished. And then, of course, we have free movement of capital. But if you come from other jurisdictions, then, so I'm talking about, even Korea, South Africa, they have strong exchange control regulations, and because they're IMF members, under the articles of IMF, there is recognition of those exchange controls. And that creates all manner of problems, especially when within, let me make it simple now, within a particular jurisdiction, you have exchange controls, and then people find ways around it. Whenever there's a prohibitory regulation, people tend to find ways around it, right? So private ordering is usually a response to this. But because the private ordering is meant to be translated to action abroad, right? So I go into some transaction and I want people to take steps abroad, maybe to pay somebody abroad, right? So I'm in Algeria, I enter into a transaction whereby I buy dollars, right? And do a swap with somebody in America to pay my supplier in America. Now, because I've done it through private ordering to find a way around exchange controls in Algeria, I'm navigating illegality, right? I'm navigating illegality. And then when it goes abroad, the system does not really understand what has happened there, right? So, and this could arise in different areas, from money laundering, whatever. The system abroad does not understand it. Now, what exactly have you done? Because nobody understands what exchange controls are about. So those things, they're not very. I was just looking the other day at so the leading book on commercial law, Roy Good's Commercial Law, and no chapter on exchange controls. So that means people really study law without understanding it. But it's a big driver here. Okay. So any other question? Okay. So. So this bit we already know, because it's really the building blocks of this course. We're going to be looking at share and loan capital. So I say the main sources of initial finance. Notice the operative word there is initial finance, because obviously as a company trades, the company is able to fund its activities through internal cash flow. Right? So we say that share capital is provided by members. So at the point where it's with members, it's not share capital, right? It's just their money. At the point where they part with it to the company, it becomes share capital. And so when they part with it and it becomes share capital, we then say it represents a right in the company. What represents the right in the company? Is it the capital or the share? The share, yeah. It's the share, yeah. So be careful about that, right? Because notice the way I've done it, and maybe I could have worded it a bit more elegantly, right? When I say share capital is provided by members, I said, since share capital is provided by members, it represents a right in the company. Actually, not terribly accurate. Maybe a better way of putting it would be to say, since share capital is provided by the members, what the members get, the share, represents a right in the company, right? But if you say, I've stated it not very elegantly, I'm in very good company. Many judges do the same thing, right? But I just thought I should unpack it. And you'll see this in some of the judgments. Now, on the other hand, of course, loan capital is provided by creditors, and they give rights against the company. So they're not rights in the company, they're rights against the company. So if you look at the Companies Act, you'll see that Section 33 of the Companies Act really defines who has rights in the company, right? It's the members who have rights in the company. So then we now say here that the rules on share capital were developed by the common law, which is entirely correct. They were developed by the common law, and I would even say that, for me, this was the high watermark of company law, because at the point where the common law judges were coming up with these rules, they did not have any template, right? They had no template. All they had was limited liability to work with. So you think about it. I mean, if I'm a judge today, my task is easy. If a case comes, I just look at the Companies Act, right? I look for cases, and I make it up. But back in the day, they had to do real original thinking. So all they had was a company, limited liability, and then they began to build rules. So when people came and said, okay, we will take a share, but we will not pay for the share, the judges had to understand the consequences of this. Or when people basically said, we will take a share, but if the company's financial affairs become embarrassed, we will be able to buy back our shares, right? And if you look at many of the cases where these arguments were coming up, the judges had to go back to basics to create rules. So that's why I say the rules are common law created. They're created by common law judges, and they're really remarkable, right? Because they all stem from this idea of limited liability. So the judges basically, what I'm trying to say to you is I'm asking you to take yourselves back to 1855, right? Because we had limited liability in 1855, right? And ask yourself, what kind of rules would I create as a judge? And that's basically what they did. And then obviously, many years later, because of obligation to comply with European law, we then introduced a comprehensive statutory code. But the statutory code actually merely codifies the common law in many cases. So it codifies the common law. So the only thing that I suppose the statutory rules did was to provide us with a better measuring device when it came to measuring share capital, right? So the statutory rules gave us a tool to measure accurately. But beyond that, the statutory rules essentially did what the common law did, right? And they've not changed. Even when we did the reform, reform the Companies Act, they've not changed. A few changes here and there, which are cosmetic. The latest change is the statement of share capital. So there's a law, there's a provision now which basically says you've got to state your share capital. It creates a lot of problems in practice. So if you look at Section 32 of the Companies Act, we'll talk about this in a minute. If you look at Section 32 of the Companies Act, it says every member of the company has a right to ask for a statement of share capital. So all those lawyers who never liked share capital, they created a lot of problems. So the Law Society Consulting doing a lot of work on how do we provide the statement of share capital. Because it's not, as the name implies, it's not as simple as, oh, the share capital is this. You've got to break everything down. How much has been paid? How much is undistributed, right? So each one requires careful analysis, right? And this came in much later, and we're going to deal with this. So beyond that, the laws have basically remained the same. So just to conclude this point, the common law rules supplied the bulk of the rules, right? And which I said we should give the judges top marks for. And then Europe came to codify and add a degree of precision in terms of measurement. And they've remained this way, notwithstanding the 2006 Companies Act, although a few statutory incursions have resulted, and the major one being the requirement to state your share capital, which members of the company have a right to call for under Section 32 of the Companies Act. Right? Okay. Now, I then say to you, as you probably know, that these rules are mostly mandatory rules. That should occasion no surprise. If we're going to have rules on how we contribute to that box, that's our imaginary box, then we're going to have mandatory rules. Otherwise, people will not do what we expect them to do. And what does that mean? When we say they're mandatory rules, it means that you cannot oust them, you cannot ratify a breach of them, right? The majority cannot say, well, we got 99%. They can't even say we got 100%. Right? You just can't do that. And I say they can be seen as part of the remedial response, company law's remedial response, to the problem of third-party risk. Because we're dealing with third parties who are not part of it, that's why the rules are not amenable to ratification. And this problem of the third party stems from limited liability. I then flag up other responses to this particular problem. So the law on directors' duty deals with this, right? To the extent that directors are required to consider the interest of creditors when a company is doubtfully solvent, right? It means that the law responds to this, right? Section 212 of the Insolvency Act deals with the misfeasance provision, which basically allows a liquidator, if the company collapses, it allows a liquidator sue the directors, sue the people who caused harm to the company and therefore to the creditors. We also have provisions which allow creditors commence collective insolvency proceedings, provisions which allow liquidators to unravel transactions, and of course we have penal norms, right? So we can send you to jail if you have acted in fraud of creditors, right? So together with these and rules on capital, we have a compendium of rules to protect creditors. So let's now look at the legal nature of the share. So if we turn to the Companies Act, so you see Section 540 says a share means share in the company's share capital. So when you think about that, share means share in the company's share capital. You know, that almost makes us look at your share as part of the share capital. Do you see that? And that brings a degree of confusion, right? So it says, remember, it says share means share in the company's share capital. But my share is in my pocket. My share is an item of property that I own. No, the company does not own my share. I own my share. What does the company own? The company owns its share capital, not my share. Right? The company owns its share capital. So when you look at that, you see that it's potentially confusing. So when you look at some of the cases, you see that it makes this distinction between the share as an item of property in your pocket being distinct from the capital fund. And even if you own all the shares of a company, it does not mean you own the capital fund. Right? So if I own all the shares of the company, right, I do not own the capital fund. So let's imagine the capital fund is the box, the treasury box, right? So we put money in the treasury box. Everybody puts £1 each, and everybody gets one share. And we say the share has a nominal value of £1, right? And so if there's £50 in the capital box, the £50 is share capital, right? You and I do not own share capital. What do you own? You own the share that you took, right? Which is not part of the share capital. And even if one of you bought all the shares of everybody, and therefore you are somehow entitled to that treasury box, we would say, no, the treasury box still belongs to the company, right? Obviously, if the company is to be liquidated and there are no creditors, then everything in the treasury box will come to you, right? But that's the only way it will come to you. Okay, so then if you look at section 541, it says that shares are personal property, all right? Shares are personal property. So you know the whole division between real and personal property. And then it says in 542, shares in a limited company having a share capital must each have a fixed nominal amount. So when I said £1, that's the nominal amount. And there's no magic to this nominal amount. It doesn't mean anything. It could be £1, £10, whatever, right? And many jurisdictions have moved away from this. They've basically said, this is confusing. We don't need the share to have a fixed nominal amount. So they've moved to what they call no par shares, no par value shares, right? The fixed nominal amount is what we call par value, right? The problem with par value is that it bears no relationship to anything that happens beyond that date, right? So, and you'll see that when we begin to measure share capital or legal capital, when we begin to measure it, we go back to par value, but we need to make adjustments. We need to make adjustments. Let me give you an example. So assuming we issue a share with a nominal value of £1, and then we say we are asking you to pay a subscription price of £3. So what comes into the company? £3. £3, right? And so when £3 comes into the company, we then say, what is share capital? Is it £3? Because £3 has gone into the box. And remember, in that box, there can only be two compartments, capital and profit. And bear in mind, once you call it profit, it means we can distribute it. So how much is in the box? And look at the law. The law says shares in a company must have a fixed nominal value. Right? Must have a fixed nominal value. So in compliance with this, we said every share will have a fixed nominal value of £1. Right? But nothing stops us, right, from asking people to pay more. And they paid £3. So when they paid £3 to the box, and then they got their share, we know what they've got. They've got their share. It's their property. So we're trying to work out what's in the box. Clearly, £3 has entered the box. But what is £3? Or rather, sorry, what is in the box legally? Yeah.
£1 is the share capital.
Yeah.
£2 are the premium.
Yes, exactly. So we need to find a way to capture that premium, right? We need to find a way to capture that premium. And why? Because of this strange rule called par value. You see, if we didn't have the rule of par value, it would just be £3. We recognize £3 that's come in. But because of this strange rule called par value, nominal value, we can only recognize share capital as £1. And therefore, in your financial statements, you'd have to create another reserve, right? To create another reserve and treat that reserve as undistributable so that it doesn't go back as profit, right? So in this case, we'll say it's a premium, call it a share premium reserve, right? Now, actually, this is what happened in Section 610 of the Companies Act, but it was not always like that. Back in the day, you would issue shares like this and then distribute it immediately as a dividend, right? So you issue shares at a subscription price higher than the nominal value. That money comes, you then take that excess, pay your existing shareholders, right? And they're rejoicing. And what the law then had to do was, in a sense, block this loophole. But now the reason I mentioned this is to show you the problem that arose from par value. If we had no par value shares, we would not have this problem, right? So that's why, if you look at Section 610, if a company issues shares at a premium to what? Premium to the nominal value, the par value, whether for cash or otherwise, a sum equal to the value of that premium must be transferred to an account called the share premium account. Right? Now, and this came only recently. So before then, people used to distribute premiums. And notice one thing here. I'm referring to section 831. A company's undistributable reserves are its share premium account. Right? So just to bring it together, don't worry, it's all on the seminar sheet, don't worry. But just to bring it together, I basically said the law says every share shall have a nominal value, a par value. And I said, this is crazy. Doesn't make any sense. It creates more complication for people. And to substantiate that point, I then said, let me show you a complication it creates. I then gave you a scenario where people issued shares above par. And then I said, so how do we treat the amount above par? Legally, this must be profit. Legally, that's the way you should treat it. Right? Because it's not capital. If it's not capital, it must be profit. The only way we can stop treating it as profit is if Parliament commands us otherwise. And that command did not come immediately. It came many, many years later. And when it came many, many years later, in the form of section 610, the law says when you issue above par, then it's a share premium. That's what he said, right? But it didn't happen immediately. And so we know this answer because of a statutory command, right? You create a share premium account, and then section 831 then tells us that the share premium account is undistributable. In other words, it's a roundabout way of saying treat it like capital. But it's not capital, but treat it like capital. So when it comes to measuring share capital, we don't just start and stop with the par value of the shares. We ask the question, are there any undistributable reserves? The way to state this would be legal capital is par multiplied by the number of shares in issue plus any undistributable reserves. It is when we have this formula, it is when we know this formula that we truly, truly know what distributable profits are. And when we know this, then you can do your corporate engineering. Then you can say, yeah, you know what, we can do redeemable shares, right? We can do share buybacks, right? Because I am confident we're not going to have any problems because we are not touching legal capital. Do you see? So, now, so here, what I've just done here was just to identify. Sorry, yeah.
So what's the purpose of par rule then? If it creates all these complicated things, why do we have a par value?
Yeah, good question. So obviously, you know, it's historical, isn't it? I suppose if you kind of go back, and people want to pay for shares. Obviously, I'm trying to simplify this. I don't think this happened, but somebody could say, you know, I could pay for shares because I have 2 pots. Another would say I have a bag of salt. Another would say I have some chicken. Right? So how do we have a standard way of measuring everything, right? To know that there is equitable contribution, right? Because even amongst the shareholders, before we get to the creditors, even amongst the shareholders, I want to be sure that if I put 1 unit of widgets in the company, I get this share. And you, too, should do the same. So the standard way of doing this would be to have a value, a par value, right? And so that's how it came about. To assure the shareholders that there was equitable contribution. Then it also meant that it also assured the creditors that everybody was entering into a promise to the creditor, right? not so it's not legal in the usual way, but there's a promise to every creditor that every shareholder will pay this figure that has been stated, so that creditors can hold them to account and say, you've not paid. So that's where the idea came from. Of course, today there are more sophisticated ways of dealing with it, but we've not dealt with it that way, and therefore we have all these complications that we then have to wrestle with. And I think it's important to kind of be aware of this, because if you pick up the Companies Act and you just read, nominal value, then many sections later you read 610, you're not going to see the link. You're not going to understand why this is there, and my point is to sort of understand the basics to see that. Okay, so here we talk about the place of the share in the taxonomy of personal property, and I'll be pretty fast here because what the judge is saying, and I just provided the quotes, he refers to Blackstone where he talks about, property, personal property being things in action or things in possession, right? So I own my car, that's a thing in possession. But the other things, the fruits, I can only enjoy by means of action, and that's what Blackstone was saying. And so here he says, what then is the character of a share in a company? It's a chosen action, right? He concludes it's a chosen action, and he says it is similar to a debt, which is correct, right? He says it is similar to a debt, but the key difference, obviously, is that the debt gives you rights against the company, the share gives you rights in the company. That's the key difference, right? And then we then get to the Borland case, where we see Farrell J. defining the share. So he says the share is the interest of the shareholder in a company measured by a sum of money. So what's the sum of money? The sum of money, obviously, is the par value, right? For the purpose of liability in the first place. So that's the promise you made to creditors. I will pay, right? And of interest in the second, but also consisting of a series of mutual covenants. So those mutual covenants are what you design, right? Do you see? So when you design these covenants and say, I will have weighted voting rights, right? For the system I just, the jurisdiction I mentioned, I didn't mention the name of the jurisdiction. I called it Ruritania, the one that had that provision which said everybody should be able to attend the general meeting. Also has another provision which says weighted voting rights is abolished. There shall be no weighted voting rights. Now, again, that does not make any sense to me, right? Because people should be able to write their own deals. And that's what the judge is saying here, that there are a series of mutual covenants entered into by all the shareholders inter se in accordance with Section 33 of the Companies Act. And he says that the contract contained in the Articles of Association is really one of the original incidents of the share. And when Martin Lipton in America designed the poison pill, right, as a way of resisting takeover bids, this was exactly what he was doing. He was saying to himself, the contract in the Articles is one of the original incidents of the share. So if it is a contract in the Articles, then I can write this contract in the Articles to create a pill for a bidder that would be difficult to swallow. So the moment you acquire our shares, right? So the moment you acquire a share of the target, you become party to this contract, right? And if you become party to the contract, and the consequence is that a poison pill has now been put before you, then you're going to find it difficult to swallow it. That's really what he was doing. And he felt able to design it this way, right? To design it this way, knowing that it was legitimate, right? That the courts will uphold it, right? So, now just think about this. Today we take it for granted, but always, I always say to people, never underestimate what, sort of the first movers did. Before he designed this. Nobody had done this. Right? So what made him sit down and say, you know what, I'm going to create a poison pill? It was because he knew this. He knew he could do anything. This is the point I'm making. And so long as you are not infringing rules on capital, and clearly he was not infringing rules on capital, because if he designs a poison pill, it has no effect on creditors, right? It has no effect on the treasury box. It's simply saying that if you launch a bid for my company and you acquire, say, 30%, then my shareholders, right, that would trigger rights in my shareholders, which will have the effect of diluting you, right? Do you understand? So that affects nothing. So there's no reason why he couldn't write it. And then here I then mention the share warrant. I said a share warrant is similar to an option. It's like an option in that it confers on the holder the right to subscribe for shares at a stipulated price. And so in other words, I'm saying it's not a share, it simply gives you a right to subscribe for shares. So let's unpack what he said. So I'm referring to Fowl J's decision. He says liability and interest. And I like the way Berkeley on company law puts it. It's, you know, I don't know if I'm the only one who admires this language. He says, you know, every time I read it, I just love the way he puts it. It says, the investor purchases immunity from liability beyond a certain point upon the terms that there shall be and remain a liability up to that limit. Right? It's so your liability is really fixed to the nominal value, right? Which obviously, if you've paid it, then there's no liability. If you've not paid it, then that's what you pay. Right? So on a winding up, creditors have the right to insist that the unpaid capital be paid. And then, what about interest? So a share is a right of participation in a company on the terms of the articles, and that's where we stop. We're not going to be like the retaining company, which says other things, right? We stop here. It'll be interesting to ask from your jurisdictions, because some people have said that one of the advantages of common law jurisdictions is the flexibility we have here. Do you come from a jurisdiction where there's any limit to the right of parties to design their shares? In your jurisdiction, are there mandatory norms? Can shareholders do anything when it comes to designing their shares? You know, does anybody? Yeah, please.
In my jurisdiction, I think there are certain types of shares that you can issue.
Okay, certain types of shares you can issue.
Yeah.
So that means there's some you cannot issue.
You can design whatever shares.
So it's been created. So there's numerous classes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What jurisdiction?
It is.
Okay. Yeah. But you get my point. It's forcing you into a straitjacket, can't you see? Or what do you think? Would you prefer a system where you're forced into a straitjacket, or one where, you know, just let your ingenuity, you know, prevail?
I don't have an opinion yet.
Okay. Do we not like freedom? Okay. Yeah. So anyway, but again, you know, Greece gave us so many things, you know. So how they are, you know. So once a share is issued, it comprises a collection of rights and obligations relating to an interest in a company. And I don't even want to say economic. I mean, Pennington says of an economic and proprietary character. I would say, why economic? Why can't we design a share with just a right of control, no income, no capital? Would that be wrong? You get my point? So Pennington here, are you getting this? So remember, just to remind you where we are, Fowl J and the Borland case. talked about a share and divided it into liability and interest, right? And then we unpacked it. And as we're unpacking the interest bit, we looked at what Pennington wrote. And Pennington says, you know, once a share is issued, it comprises a collection of rights and obligations relating to an interest in a company, and I agree with that. Then he goes on to say, of an economic character. And I say, why does it have to be of an economic character? Why can't we design a share with a non-economic character? So if a share has three aspects: control, i.e. voting, income, dividends, capital, surely we could design a share with only control. In which case, sorry? Yeah, a golden share, yeah, and you just eliminate, I mean, the point I'm making is that you can simply create that, and then, I mean, most golden shares will also have an economic side, right, because of the interest of the, usually the state and all that. But the point I'm making is that nothing precludes you. I know there was a case in Chicago in the 50s or 40s where such a share was created, and they said, oh, no, this could not be. This is wrong. But I think that's bad law, right? Because, you know, because you're trampling on the right of people to design the share as they see fit. Okay, and here I talk about shares and entity shielding. Remember, I introduced this idea before. So, and when I talk about this, then we'll take a break at the point of configuring the right of participation. But let me just talk about entity shielding. So, notice here, he says a share is therefore a fractional part of the capital. It's the confusion. The capital belongs to the company. The share is mine. So that's wrong, just like I was wrong. So, well, that's why I said I'm in good company. Maybe the real thing is to say is that, you know, maybe should he say the capital contribution made by the shareholder is a fractional part of the capital, right? Then he says, it confers upon, so now when he says it, he's not referring to the capital or the capital contribution, he's now referring to the share. It confers upon the holder a certain right to a proportionate part of the assets of the company. So the share confers upon me a right to a proportionate part of the assets of the company. But that does not mean that I can just go to the company and open the box and take things out, because remember the shield protects the capital fund, right? So although I have this right to a proportionate part of it, that right can only be exercised through certain gateways. In other words, through a dividend, right? Through a reduction of capital duly done, or through winding up. So let's just focus on winding up. Let's not make it complex. So I only have anything on winding up, not before, if we're making it. So here it says it confers upon the holder a certain right to a proportionate part of the assets of the company, whether by way of dividend, the distribution of assets, and winding up. It forms, however, a separate right of property, and that's really the idea I want us to be clear about. It's a separate right of property. The capital is the property of the company. Then he says again, the share, although it's a fraction of the capital, is property of the corporator. You see, I have a problem when we say the share is a fraction, right? The share is my share, it's not a fraction. It is the capital contribution that is a fraction. Then he says here, the aggregate of all fractions, if collected in 2 or 3 hands, does not constitute the corporators the owners of the capital, which is true. It remains the property of the company. Right? And then here we see Lord Evershed in Short and Treasury Commissioners, where he says, shareholders are not in the eye of the law part owners of the undertaking. The undertaking is something different from the totality of the shareholders. Right? So I think by now it should be pretty clear, about this distinction. And you can see that sometimes the books model it together, but I think, if you just sort of always separate it, then a lot of clarity will prevail. So let's go for our 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and start with configuration. Okay.
Qual è il problema? Perché la domanda come con la a chi appartiene l'azione? Appartiene solo appartiene a te, però il capitale di cui fa parte l'azione appartiene a te. È un no, lui la posizione, l'azione è no, tu possiedi soltanto i diritti che nascono dai... tu non è che non puoi neanche reclamare.
Però non è nel senso, io forse non sto capendo, però l'azione, l'obbligazione sono di proprietà della persona che acquista. Poi tu devi rispondere, godere di diritti e obbligazioni che ti sporgono. Detto questo, tutto ciò che incorpora, perché è una fizione è di proprietà dell'impresa, perché sia i soldi che dai sono della banca, cioè sia nell'ultimo caso che non si può solo che il diritto alle spalle nel caso hai il diritto all'interesse, nel caso di o lo scioglimento, quindi
se l'azione è tua perché e allora se tu vai facciamo queste cose tu puoi dire io lo ricordo
io ho 100% di azioni, io
il capitale è la proprietà della società. Quindi se tu hai il 100% del capitale, hai il 100% del capitale.
però non si cioè se fallisce la corporation non fallisci tu. E tu prendi il capitale solo nei limiti del capitale, non del condominio. Poi chiaramente per capitale sociale, diciamo senza chiaramente risulterà nell'azione un titolo, un item of property che incorpora i diritti e obbligazioni all'interno del diritti e obbligazioni sia patrimoniali che c'è anche nemmeno io per ora ancora ragiono molto sui diritti italiani. La legislazione è un ripeto che incorpora diritti e obblighi e anche qui si dice che share is an item of property that empower the rights and obligation to the owner. The obligation is the corporation, whether to do right to the company.
Like 20 minutes.
No, è della corporation il capitale, non è tuo. Quindi in realtà tu non è che se siamo qua, il no, è un problema terminologico, ma non come si risolve? Se tu hai una abbiamo detto che tu fai, c'è lui ci fa capitare, capitale che io chiedo quello che tu quindi tu hai
cioè questa cosa non si fa mai nelle cose del capitale, poi 100% selezione e no, c'è l'indicazione che sono dei titoli che rappresentano il 100% del capitale, non sono necessari, sono poi il 100% del capitale, come capitale, non si compra il
Okay, so so here we basically in sort of transaction mode where we're basically trying to advise parties who come together who want to do a deal. This could be in the context of a private equity transaction, whatever the transaction is, where people have competing interests, and the role of the lawyer is to find a way to achieve some kind of accommodation. The accommodation is usually never total, but partial. But so long as people can sort of coalesce around a deal which makes commercial sense to them, then that's fine. And my point basically is that in regard to shares, the three aspects. You have the voting, dividend, and capital rights, and how you design this is really a matter for the parties. I say ultimately it's a marketing issue. It's not a legal issue. Then the other point to mention is that you may have, try to imagine you have ordinary shares and somebody says, can we convert ordinary shares into preference shares? That's something we're going to look at next week. But they raise very complicated issues, right? So if you want to convert ordinary shares into redeemable preference shares, you'll notice that they raise very complex issues. So that's the detail. And we're going to look at it because these points could come up in transactions. But just bear in mind that the key thing here is that the law operates with a set of presumptions when it comes to configuring rights. Now, and those presumptions are canons of construction. So the law basically approaches what you've done with these canons of construction. And that's pretty straightforward because ultimately all we're trying to do is just work our contract with no effect on creditors. The reason why the example I gave you is complex is because actually at that point you begin to engage the interest of creditors. Because if you've designed a share as ordinary shares, and then you then say, these ordinary shares can be converted into redeemable preference shares, you're striking at the heart of the creditor. You're basically saying to the creditor that the residual claimant, the guy at the bottom of the pecking order, is now elevated, right? So you're taking all the ordinary shares and saying potentially they're now redeemable. You're basically saying the capital disappears, right? Do you see the problem? You're saying capital disappears. Now, at that point, you can see that we're being confronted by mandatory rules. That's why we're stopping. That's why we can't do it. But if you don't infringe those rules, then you can do whatever you want to do. And that's the point I'm making, that then all you're just dealing with is just canons of construction. So I hope that point is clear. I'm going to talk about the canons of construction, right? So you have to basically be aware of the situations where all you're doing is just construction, and the courts will give effect to it, and other situations where the client is asking you to do something which looks like construction, but actually what it does is to drive a coach and horses through rules on capital. And the example I just gave, which is, let's convert ordinary shares into redeemable preference shares, would be a classic one. Okay, so one, there is a presumption of equality, unless displaced. So every share is deemed equal, right? So these are canons of construction. The moment you begin to displace equality, you're creating another class of shares. So if we displace equality in regard to voting, then we now know we have another class of shares in regard to voting. If we displace equality in regard to income, we know we're creating preference shares, right? Because if we say some people get paid first, then you're saying they have a preference. A preference as to what? Well, as to income. What about capital? Well, you did not state it. For you to have a preference as to capital, you also have to state it. So if you're going to design a preference share by displacing the presumption of equality with respect to income, you need to ask the question, do we need to displace it in regard to capital? Because it's not going to be inferred. It's not going to be inferred. And what does this mean? What does this mean? Displacing in regard to income just means they get paid their dividends first, right? Displacing it with respect to capital means that if the company is to be wound up, they get their capital back first. Do you follow? They get their capital back first. So if you've not displaced it fully and the company is to be wound up, the preference shareholders, although called preference shareholders, will be treated like ordinary shareholders, right? Because all they bargained for was a displacement in regards to income. So notice here we say, sorry, I'll do. So notice here we say priority rights must be stated to displace the presumption of equality. If you don't state it, then you're not going to do that. So here, priority to capital will not be inferred merely because there is priority to income, right? Also, a priority in respect of capital does not confer an entitlement to participate in the distribution of surplus assets, right? So what does this mean? You wind up the company, and you then say, okay, we have preference shares. Why do we have preference shares? Because under the terms of issue, we displaced income, right? We displaced the equality principle with regard to income. We displaced the equality principle in regard to capital, i.e., the preference shareholders get their capital back first. Okay, so they get their capital back, right? So maybe they put £5, you get £5 back. But there's surplus assets, right, to be distributed amongst the ordinary shareholders. Do the preference shareholders have a right to share in the surplus assets over and above their £5? Now, the law is that if you want to participate in the distribution of surplus assets, then you need to state it. That's why you have participating preference shares, right? So a priority in respect of capital does not confer an entitlement to participate in the distribution of surplus assets. participating rights must therefore be specified. Right? And notice, preference shares may be issued as redeemable or convertible. Right? But notice, we never said ordinary shares can be issued, right, as convertible into fully redeemed preference shares, right? Because we know that that will engage capital rules. They may have voting rights. They may be participating. All depends on what you negotiate, right? And if you are greedy enough, and you have enough power, your preference shares will begin to resemble ordinary shares. So you get all the benefits of preference shares, but also the benefits of ordinary shares. So here I said, once preference shares begin to resemble ordinary shares, because they have voting rights, right? So they have voting rights, they can participate in your company, and they're participating so they can share in surplus assets. So in other words, they have not only a prior return of capital, so they get their monies back first, but they're also given a rateable share in surplus assets in liquidation. Then we call them preference ordinary shares. Now that's the sweet spot, right? If you have enough power and greed and conning and whatever, right? That's the sweet spot, right? So the point basically is that it's ultimately a matter of drafting. So let me give you an example how this could work. So imagine a company is a company has preference shares, and you're paying dividend rates to preference shareholders at, let's say, 10% interest. And then later the economy is good, interest rates in the market fall to about 1%. I mean, if you go to the bank now, I'd say 1%. So you're the treasurer of the company. Now, what do? Do you continue to pay the preference shareholders 10%? Or do you do a reduction? Do you vary the 10%? Do you say, let's do a variation in your coupon by moving 10% to 1%? Now, if you do that, it's going to be called a variation of class rights, right? Because that right that the preference shareholders have is a right attached to their shares, and they form a class, right? And because it's a class right, you cannot do it without their consent, right? So you cannot move it from 10% to 1%. But you can move it from 10 to 0. You can't move it from 10 to 0. How? I knew that would get your attention, by basically saying to them that we want to expel you. So we want to expel you. And how do we expel you? We do a mini winding up, right? We do a mini winding up. What's a mini winding up? A reduction of capital, right? So we basically say, we're going to do a mini winding up. And, who are the guys who have a prior right of return for capital? The preference shareholders. So we give you your money back and say to preference shareholders, thank you very much. We enjoyed doing business with you. We don't need your money anymore. You can go. Now, at that point, the preference shareholders are not going to be too happy. They're going to say, why are you expelling us? That's what they're going to be saying. But we're going to be saying to them, we're not expelling you unlawfully. We're simply giving effect to the very agreement you signed. And what was the agreement you signed? You agreed to be treated with priority on a return of capital. You basically negotiated for a prior right of return of capital. Now, why do you think this prior right of return should only occur at liquidation? If we do a mini liquidation, i.e. a reduction of capital, then it can occur. And so when we give you your money then, it is not an infringement of your rights, but simply the fulfillment of the very rights you entered into. Do you get it? So in a sense, it's because when we look at it, when we look at the prior right of return from a winding up perspective, we always think, wow, you know, at least the preference shareholder is protected. But it could bite the other way, where you're trying to change the interest rates, right? I mean, the way to solve this would be, if I were advising the preference shareholder, I would put in a clause to say, in the articles, to say that on a reduction of capital, the reduction shall be deemed to be a variation of class rights. That way, I would trigger class right provisions. Do you see? So that way you completely block it. So the moment you try to do a reduction to zero, I'll just say, well, this is a variation of class rights in the articles. Right? So, so you can see here, so notice here, so this term sheet, remember the question we looked at, right, where we talked about NewCo and the party who was coming in and wanted 3 to 5 years exit and all that, you know, how do you negotiate it? So basically, notice here we have this term sheet, and so we look at the capital structure. We have preference shares, right, and then notice preference ordinary, right, and then ordinary shares, right, and then other classes. And notice one thing, with ordinary shares, we only had capital dividend voting. With preference shares, we had redemption conversion. I remember I said earlier, you can't sort of take ordinary shares and convert ordinary shares into redeemable preference shares, right? Because then you'll be engaging capital rules. And ultimately, it's really a matter of how you negotiate this. Bearing in mind these canons of construction. So there are only two things you need to bear in mind here, that if we intrude into capital, right? If we start eating into capital, if we write in, I remember there was a case where some Saudi Arabian investors came in and they entered into some property deals in London, and they formed a company, and they basically said that every year the company should liquidate assets of the company, you know, the property development. They should sell assets and pay a return to the shareholders from the proceeds of sale, right? So there was a legal obligation to sell property and pay, dividends or to do share buybacks, whatever, from the proceeds of sale. But the way they worded it, they did it in such a way that it could be considered to be eating into capital, right? Because it was so strong that if the company could not sell, there was still an obligation to pay. So at that point, you know that there's a problem with the clause. Whoever drafted it had not realized that it will conflict with company law principles. Just the same way, anybody who tries to convert ordinary shares, all your ordinary shares, into redeemable preference shares would be transgressing. Now, so beyond knowledge of that, if you're dealing in the other context where we don't have to worry about that, then all you're just looking at is the need to specify your rights, right? If you don't specify your rights, then it will come back to haunt you. And that also means that when advising, you can only advise based on the rights you see, not based on the description. So, if somebody says, oh, we have preference shares, that does not mean anything to me, right? I have to ask, what preference as to what? So what does this mean? I look at the Articles of Association, the terms of issue, to specify whether they have a preference as to capital or a preference as to income, and do they have participating rights? Do they have cumulative rights? Do you see? You can't just advise based on the description. And then in terms of legal terminology of capital, by now you know that capital, we use the term capital in different contexts. When the Companies Act refers to capital, it's going to talk about issued and allotted share capital. It's going to talk about called up share capital. It's going to talk about equity capital. You've got to be aware of which one is relevant for your purposes. So very, very simply, there's really no difference between issued and allotted capital, right? Well, there's a slight difference if you really want to be detailed about it, which is about, when you allot a share, you create a right in contract. When you issue it, you've created a right in property, right? So if I allot a share to you, then I'm contractually bound to follow up with the perfection of it. When I issue shares, then you've basically acquired property rights. So we tend to use them interchangeably. If you look at the IRC case, you see this distinction, right, being drawn out. But most times in the books, they run them together, but just bear that in mind. Now, right, okay. Now, the key one is called up share capital. Why do I say the key one? Because when we talk about capital, we're really focusing on the box, right? That box. That's the box we want to protect. So the box we want to protect is the called up capital. In other words, when you called up, how much got in there? Do you understand? That's really what you want to protect. And so you need a number, right? So you may have allotted or issued share capital, but you've not called up. Then, we're not too worried about that. But when you called up, and we say, okay, let's imagine you have £10,000 in that box as called up capital, then we have a number. Now, to know legal capital, we then need to ask, are there any undistributable reserves? And once we identify undistributable reserves, and I've given you one example, the share premium account, under Section 610 of the Companies Act, then we add called up share capital plus undistributable reserves gives us legal capital. Now, with that number, so let's imagine £10,000 called up share capital. Undistributable reserves would be, let's say, £5,000. So all in all, we have 15,000. If we look at the company's bank account and we see 20,000, then I know 5,000 can be distributed. That's the bottom line, right? So the bottom line is I take called up share capital, ask myself, are there any undistributable reserves? I can aggregate them together and then ask, what are shareholder funds? When I said look at the bank account, what I mean is shareholder funds, right? That's what we call it. If you look at the balance sheet of a company, you say, the shareholder funds are the final figure. So you say, how much is shareholder funds? And if shareholder funds is 20,000, right? Then you can distribute 5,000, right? Because legal capital will be 15. Right? So, and this is what I do here. Legal capital before 1948 was par multiplied by the number of shares in issue. Then I talked about the emergence of low par value shares with a high subscription price. Remember the example I gave? Then I said the result of this practice was that the part which was above par was not part of legal capital, since legal capital was par multiplied by number of shares in issue. And if it was not part of legal capital, it then meant it could be distributed. So this had to be reversed in 1948 with the enactment of Section 610, which creates the share premium account as an undistributable reserve. And then I said for a full list of undistributable reserves, let's look at Section 831. And that's what I looked at earlier when we identified the share premium account as an undistributed reserve. Therefore, legal capital, this is why we call it the capital yardstick, is therefore measured this way. Par multiplied by the number of shares in issue plus any undistributable reserve. Right? And so essentially, that is the keys. Now, when we meet, right, because if you notice here, I said this is a prelude to 73. The rules in 73, right, and what 73, actually I would need you to do some preparation, so I'll be uploading that pretty soon. The rules in 73 are very technical rules, very boring, but to give life to them, to make them interesting and not boring, I say read this bit, right, the prelude. It provides a construct to make them understandable. Essentially, we just want to, there's a conflict going on between two groups of people, and we just want to achieve some kind of accommodation. right, at the point where people contribute into the treasury box, right? So when next we meet, we'll continue from that, right? Okay. Okay, thanks, yeah.